day already, Sabrina, and all of you who have already contributed. Our next speaker is Lahra Smith, who is Associate Professor in Political Science at Georgetown University, and who has a particular interest in African politics. So her recent research focused on questions of equality and citizenship in contemporary Africa. Her book, Making Citizens in Africa, Ethnicity, Gender, and National Identity in Ethiopia, was published by Cambridge University Press. And some of you may have been at the workshop we did on Ethiopia and Eritrea last year at Howard University. Was anybody there who's here today? That was a really great workshop, and we hope, we've had her now, this is the third time in our program.
Yes.
Welcome.
It is. Thanks. Yeah, I'm a sucker for these Saturday workshops. They're a lot of fun. So thank you, Susan, for inviting me again, and thank you all for coming out. I do actually really enjoy participating in the teachers' workshop, so thank you for the opportunity to be here. And actually, more recently, my research is looking at social studies curriculums in East Africa. So just this summer, I was in Kenya, working with a woman who is the coordinator at the Ministry of Education's curriculum department, who's coordinating a major reform of the middle and high school social studies curriculum in Kenya. So they're in the thick of it over there in their middle school and high school curriculum around social studies as well. So they have a lot of curiosity and sympathy for what you all are doing. And it's really fun to think about what a middle-income country like Kenya is doing around social studies curriculum. So thanks for having me. Let me get my notes up here. You know, early on, Sabrina encouraged us to think about sort of the average student in classes. So I want to encourage you as I go through and it sounds like you already do this. So in a way, I'm only reminding us all to do something that sounds like we're already doing, sort of not that person who's already sort of really deeply engaged in the subject we have, or the student who's already checked out, but that sort of middle student, and how can we keep them engaged, that sort of middle of the road sort of student on these topics. Today I'm going to talk about Africa, and in a way Africa is the best one to pull up, following my colleague Scott Taylor. This was sent to me this summer by a student who took my African Studies capstone course. Actually, she sent it to the whole class and said, the weather in Africa. In all those climate areas across the whole continent, it's 75 degrees and partly cloudy. And so to me, that's sort of the goal of any area studies course, I suppose, is if your students get the joke of this at the end of it, you've accomplished your mission, which is the absurdity of the whole sort of exercise of it. So we all got the joke and we laughed and thought it was pretty funny. Of course, you know, and again, there's always that sort of overlap. So I was going to start with the danger of the single story too, which Professor Taylor has already talked about. I do encourage you to use Adichie's TED Talk on this danger of a single story, because it's a lovely teaching tool, frankly, not just for African studies, because her point, I think, is a much broader one. And in fact, the illustration that she gives is of an American approaching her about her beautiful novel, Purple Hibiscus, which is about a very personal story set in Nigeria, and sort of globalizing that to all Nigerian and frankly all African families. And then she counters with a novel that she had read from the United States that's about serial killers, and she responds, I don't know if anybody's seen this, right? She says, well, I'm sorry that all Americans are serial killers, right? The point is that it's absurd, right? Because we have so many stories from America that we know that not all Americans are serial killers. But what I love about Adichie's point, right, is that the challenge is to add more stories, not less. And that's what we're all doing in our area studies classrooms, right? Is as we've already set up this sort of critique of area studies, is to say we're not surrendering to the sort of Cold War ideology of the roots of area studies, and we're also not surrendering to the 30,000 foot, there's a globe and there it is. We're saying we need lots more stories at that sort of local level to counter the danger of the single story. And they're sometimes sad and difficult stories, they're sometimes beautiful, rich, exciting, positive stories, and if we had millions of those stories for each of the areas that we're working in, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, that were as rich as the knowledge that we have of places like the United States, so that when Slovenian students come into our high school gyms, right, they say, this is from the movies, because they've all been inundated with visions of America. Many false, frankly, of course, right? But they have lots of visions of the United States, for better or for worse, and unfortunately have very limited, our students often have very limited visions of the various regions in the world, and often, as I'm sure many of you know, based on the the rich examples that you've already provided from your classrooms, even if they come from one of these regions of the world, because these regions are so vast, their own visions of these regions are also somewhat limited, right? So if they're coming from the Caribbean, their knowledge of Latin American studies is also limited to that sort of sub-region very often, right? So we often find in African studies, for example, that students come in saying, well, I mean, I'm from Senegal, but actually I don't know a lot about the rest of the continent. I've not had the opportunity to learn more about the rest of the continent. And so I'm excited to learn about it in your class. And I'm sure that will be true for students in your other so-called area studies classes as well. And so that's really the exciting opportunity that we have in all of our classes. And so in that sense, Africa, of course, is not unique, but it's an exciting, incredibly diverse, massively growing continent that I find incredibly dynamic and exciting to teach about, and really enjoy the challenge of both convincing students, though I'm lucky that I teach at Georgetown, I don't have to do quite as much convincing as I used to have to do when I taught at other universities and other parts of the United States where I needed to be a little more convincing. But it is exciting sort of place to teach about, because there's so much happening on the continent, as we know. So I want to talk a little bit about some ways to teach about African area studies, really as an example. Obviously, the things that I might say today are highly illustrative, right? What I can do in 30 minutes on African studies is actually really only intended to be sort of an illustration of what might be done. And that's my goal in the few minutes that I have with you. And as my colleague has said, my contact is there. I would love to have a dialogue with any of you, whether you're teaching a whole course on African studies or you just decide to spend a few weeks on it and you'd love to think through how to do something on youth on the continent, because you think that your students would really enjoy a unit that looks at youth in some part of Africa, or cities, African cities, for example. And there's lots of really exciting examples. Some of these resources are there. So for example, the language question is a really great example of that. Some of your students in your classes, again, several of you have already noted that students may talk about the languages that they themselves speak, particularly in the DC metro area, with a lot of students from the continent who may themselves be living in bilingual or multilingual homes speaking African languages. It's a great opportunity to talk about the tremendous linguistic diversity on the continent, and to explore that and look at that. And there's a number of resources about that. One that I use is let's see if this, yes, of course, it's not going to link out. Tested it this morning. Let's see the best way to do this.
You have to, yeah.
Let me see. Will the other ones not work then either?
You probably sometimes have to click it, or you can just go back and forth.
This one will work.
Yeah.
I wonder why the other one didn't work.
I don't know.
Anyway, that's too bad. Well, so that site, you can find that link. I'm going to go back to this one. There's just a lot of the links that Susan provided in the packet for you. I'm going to try to play this without sound while I'm talking for a quick second. There's some films that you can access. Of course, as my librarian will tell you, a lot of these films are really expensive because I'm always requesting them and they're always telling me they're too expensive. So try to borrow them from our library. Email me if you want, and I'll try to help you access some of the films that are there. They're wonderful ones. There's also a lot more open source things like this that are great, videos that are opportunities to showcase to our students the real vitality on the continent, reflecting, this is Congo Brazzaville, an example of a place that frankly probably most students have literally never even heard of as a distinct country. This is not the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this is the other Congo. And opportunities, it's a series of videos that's really well made. And what's fun about it is, right, it gives students a vision of some of the economic challenges. You see sort of dusty roads and folks, grinding their food, but you also see people playing basketball. There's a wrestler that's featured. There's musicians. There's children playing. There's a real richness to life that kind of showcases a wider range of life than we typically see in our sort of media presentations, right? And these are opportunities for students to, I think, as so many of you have already given in your illustrations, right? To both showcase more positive stories, to add to the stories of the continent or the regions that we're looking at, but also to find ways to hook our students in to topics that maybe they don't have either an immediate interest in or that they haven't been exposed to before. So there's just a lot of wonderful resources out there. The one that I had hoped to show you on language, let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah,
You can always paste it.
Just copy and paste.
And I even tried to do that and it didn't do. So I don't want to spend too long on it.
It
It won't even copy paste, isn't that?
Really?
See,
Oh,
it's
because
not
that's
even
if you go out of presentation mode, then you can copy paste.
Can I? That's all right.
Just
Yeah, it's okay. There's some of the other links are also, so Africa as a Country is an amazing website, but they also do Africa as a Radio, which has music stuff. I was actually gonna suggest, but you're all already ahead of me on several things, so I sort of feel humbled with my examples because you're all already doing them. I do those sorts of things in my classes as well, where I have music playing when they come in, for example, right? And so it sounds like high school and college is not that different, right? We're all trying to do the same things to kind of hook them in. But I also think there's something, and I'm sure you experience this even more than me, but we're seeing differences in our students as they develop, right? As media impacts sort of how they learn. I think they don't listen in quite the same way. So I like to do things in my classroom that require them to stop and listen. So I do more radio stuff. There's some radio podcasts that I use. That they actually have to listen to that have no video and no transcript, so they have to sit there for 5 minutes and like listen to an NPR piece, just a 5-minute piece. But there's no other input, right? There's nothing they can read and there's nothing they can watch. They have to listen to it to get the information that they need, and it sort of forces another kind of learning that's I would argue kind of a relatively underdeveloped skill set in our students right now. So luckily, I think in African studies, we have some of those resources, and I'm sure in the other area studies as well. Let me see if this last one will link. Okay, I hope it does. So Africa as a Country is a website that I mentioned to you, is a great one. They have this awesome spread, just as an example, about using these tiny little kiosks. These are small kiosks that people sell things from in a lot of cities in sub-Saharan Africa, so they'll sell shirts and things like that from these kiosks in urban areas, but they've been turned into art spaces in Accra, Ghana, and so artists will display their art in Accra, and so they did a series on this. Again, a great opportunity to show students what kinds of exciting things are happening in African cities, but also an art scene, right? Sort of reach out maybe to those who are interested in arts as a different sort of hook on their interests as well. So those are just some examples that I wanted to show you. Maps, as has already been suggested, obviously a really important sort of pedagogical tool that many of us use in area studies, no matter what grade level we're teaching at. What I think we find, and I'm sure you wouldn't probably disagree with this, is that the challenge in many of these regions, and I think I would argue in Africa in particular, is that many of those maps are sort of negatively themed. So these are some of the negatively themed maps that I might have pulled up for you and chose not to. HIV/AIDS, education levels, those could be positive or negative. Certainly education and school enrollment levels have been rising rapidly across the continent in the last 10 years, so that can tell a sort of positive story for sure. But certainly in general, those are challenges that the continent faces. Economic, like night lights is one that often gets used, I think, both to show the development challenges for the continent, but it often is this sort of gasping moment, right? If you've ever seen it, it's this satellite imagery that shows how much of the continent does not have electricity, right? And then people sort of gasp and go, oh my God, how can those people live without lights? So I'm not showing you the night lights map intentionally. The Ebola map is somewhat infamous. Professor Taylor still has on his door, we all appreciate it, the map of Africa that does not have Ebola, which is of course the vast majority of the continent. Our study abroad to Africa is still affected by Ebola years later, we're sorry to say, and we're on a personal mission to turn that around and get students back to study abroad in Africa years after the Ebola epidemic has passed.
Despite the fact that it's not close to West Africa.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's so the map of Africa. Anyway, I did not put it up on purpose, but that's the point. But having your students go in search of maps of Africa that have more positive messages could be even a mission for them. So this is just one tiny example of one I found just this week. That's a really fun one that I wanted to share with my students. It's active tech hubs. I mean, I'm not a techie, but your students probably are. And they probably, if they could figure out what this map means, it would be a fun exercise for them. So the red are countries with 10 plus technology hubs. The teal are 5 to 10 hubs. And of course, I need my glasses. The gray are the less than 3 hubs. But obviously much of the continent does not have these sort of technology hubs, but lots of the continent does, right? And then they can sort of read along the bottom and see that 50% of the countries which countries have these technology hubs. They might go in and do projects on these countries, Kenya, South Africa. What are these technology hubs? Places like Kenya have, and South Africa and Nigeria have done amazing innovations in technology. Mobile money, well before the United States has been doing mobile money. People in Kenya pay all of their household bills. They get their income into their phones. They pay all their bills out of their phones, and they've been doing it for years. They sort of laugh at us, at how reticent we are to use our phones to do sort of day-to-day financial transactions. So there's some really great maps out there and some fun opportunities for our students to use map tools, not only for the mapping exercises and the geography exercises, but to sort of add to their knowledge of the sort of other kinds of stories coming out of the continent. And again, to get them to engage with topics that might be more interesting to them, think about what they want to do with technology, what kinds of tech jobs they might want to have, for example. As has already been mentioned, of course, the general way that many of us in area studies grapple with and sort of undermine the problematics of the fact that Africa is far too big to tackle is to break it down into subregions. So the first thing I do, I'm teaching this semester a African politics class. Well, what does that mean? That is impossible in one 15-week semester to teach the politics of Africa. It has no prerequisites. I cannot assume they've taken African history, and many of them have not. I cannot assume, yes, many of them have landed there without choosing it. It fits in their schedule. Some are deeply devoted. So our students have the range that your students have at the sort of equivalent at a college level, but a similar sort of range. And so part of how we tackle it is to break the continent down into these subregions. And then to make sure, because there are some meaningful, certainly historical distinctions amongst these subregions. There's some ways to talk about these subregions that bring them together and help them to cohere. There are some differences within the subregions, but there's more coherence within those subregions than at the continental level. And so then within that, you can sort of start to create patterns. So that's, really an important way that we sort of tackle the vastness of the continent. Then, of course, history. even when we're teaching contemporary issues, and I suspect that for many of you, whether you're teaching an area studies course or a global studies or a world history class, no matter what the way that you're asked to teach these topics, history has to be there, whether it's in the title or it's not in the title. We all have to grapple with the history of these regions. We can't avoid it, and frankly, we wouldn't want to anyway. And so that's the way that we approach it. So for example, in my African politics course, though it is meant to be contemporary politics, I have to spend a few weeks talking about some of the founding leaders of African politics. This is just one example. This is Julius Nyerere, the first president of independent Tanzania. But I can't talk about Tanzanian politics today without talking about some of these founding leaders, for example. And so the other way that I tackle area studies in addition to subregions is then to sort of think about epics in history. I was talking with my colleague who will present later today on Asian studies about epics in history. Epics in history in different parts of the world look different. We have a distinct challenge in African studies in that much pre-colonial history comes from oral traditions and is not as written. And so the pre-colonial history in other parts of the world is understood and recorded in different ways. It's exciting because there's some really great work that's coming out of pre-colonial African history. And so if you have students that are interested in archaeology or oral history, this is a really exciting opportunity to dig into some of that. We can definitely connect you with some of those sources if you want to use some of that in your courses. We have a scholar of early African history here at Georgetown that we could connect you with to think about that as well. But in general, that's definitely one of our challenges in African studies, is that much of the pre-colonial history was not recorded. And where it was understood orally, because colonial rulers did not respect and appreciate that oral history, some of that valuable history was really lost early on. And so that remains a challenge. But we certainly have some of it, and it's important and documented. There's also the opportunity to look at archives and primary sources for those of you who are thinking about sort of, and I know many of you as part of your curricular have to look at not only content, but also materials, right? Do we have primary sources? Do we have media sources? How do you sort of check those boxes as well? And African studies is an opportunity to think about sources as well, because there are some really interesting primary sources. You have colonial sources, colonial historical sources in archives, some of which has been digitized, and we could point you to some of those at some of the premier universities that do African history, and your students could access some of those colonial histories, as well as some of the really important independence leader, their speeches, their early written documents of some of these early liberation movements and independence heroes. And I often, and Professor Taylor and I were just talking about this, really make sure that my students read these sources as they're getting into African politics, so that they're accessing some of these independence leaders, particularly looking at Pan-Africanism as a movement. Again, adding to this sort of countering this idea that African studies starts, in 1980 or something, 1990, right? That in fact there were African leaders in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that were these founding fathers of the states that we see today, and that they were writing about and giving speeches that really form a corpus of the African states that we have today. And in some cases, like Julius Nyerere, that's often why I give him as an example, really articulating interesting visions of the country that they wanted to found. And so if you think about Kiswahili as a language that some of your students probably speak, a language that we teach here at Georgetown, for example, Julius Nyerere had a vision for what Kiswahili would be as a kind of unifying language for his country. And it's a great opportunity for students to kind of think about, well, what does it mean if you live in a country with lots of languages, to sort of think about which language should be the language of the state. And how would you go about doing that? And again, that's something that obviously has immediate relevance to them in thinking about multilingualism in their own lives in a multilingual city such as we live in Washington, D.C. And Nyerere's writings are really accessible and rich and interesting. Example, he was himself a high school teacher before he was the president. So that's why he's called Mwalimu, which means teacher, and he's often referred to as Mwalimu by Tanzanians while he was alive and before he passed away. So he's just a great example of that. When we worked, and I think this might be on one of your handouts, when we worked early on with our colleagues at Roosevelt this summer, and I think my colleagues Figal, Adelie, and Julian worked on this, and then again later in the summer we worked together. We came up with some themes. These are not the exhaustive themes, but it's interesting. These themes are many of the same themes that I tackle when I come up, so they are in your folder. When I write a syllabus, I take the subregions, the historical sort of periods that I've outlined, and very similar types of themes, and mash them together. I mean, this is the art of a college syllabus, and I suspect quite similar to how you match these things up with whatever curricular requirements you have from your districts, and so on. But these are the themes that we talked about as possibilities for the various 4 area studies courses at Roosevelt, just as a way to kind of organize ideas for the various area studies. And obviously you might not be able to do all of them depending on if you have a semester or a year, but what would be topics that students would find interesting, and then, you know, obviously a way to do that is not to say, well, I'm going to do environment for all the countries, but to sort of say, okay, I'm going to take a country or a sub-region for this region, and I'm going to do environment for that sub-region, right? And then I'm going to take another sub-region and another theme and map it that way. And that's a way to sort of give real meat to the sub-regions and to the topics as well, or at least one way to do it, certainly how I tackle it in my classes as well. So I want to spend the few minutes remaining that I have thinking about that one theme. And so the one I chose was migration, partly because the other class that I'm teaching right now is migration in and from Africa. You'll forgive me if I chose one that's fresh on the brain. But it's also really topical. I suspect it's one that your students might also find really interesting to them, either because they themselves have migration stories or experiences, but also even if they don't, personally, it's something that's so much in the news that globally that I think is one that might could be given relevance and meaning to them. It's certainly very important in the African studies context right now, and so there's opportunities to think about sort of definitions of migration terms that we're hearing in the media and think about those in the African context. Opportunities to think about history, mapping sources, or mapping exercises, for example, looking at different maps. There's some beautiful maps that IOM has, for example, of migration routes right now that are, again, freely available on the internet that students could look at. Again, each time you're in a map, right, then students are sort of getting different countries in their head. They're getting a sense that this is a big continent, and it gets them beyond sort of memorizing the map of the continent, but really kind of digging into it, which is exciting. Again, looking at different kinds of sources might be an opportunity for that as well. So I want to give 3 quick examples and then just show you some pictures at the end, just to wrap up. So for example, in my class this week, we read an article about the migration of men to South African mines since 1900 to 2016. I don't know if the article isn't that up to date, but until very recently. And it was a great article, but it gave us the opportunity to do a number of things. We started by looking at an excellent list of migration terms that's on the IOM website, and it's just literally a sort of dictionary of migration terms. What's a refugee versus an IDP? What's forced migration versus voluntary? All these things we're hearing in the media, right? Are these people crossing the Mediterranean refugees? Are they economic migrants, right? Why are we even disagreeing about this? But now you've got this sort of both historical and contemporary pattern of migration in Africa. That's this opportunity to think about things that actually have really contemporary meaning. So we talked about these definitions from the IOM website. We talked a little bit about the history of mines in South Africa, which again, students have heard about South Africa, right? They've heard about apartheid. How did people live in cities? What was this, how did men end up working in these mines? So they have a kind of a curiosity about apartheid as well, right? There's protests going on in South Africa right now, right? So that also, there might be a news media report that you could pull up about student protests going on in South Africa right now that could kind of catch them. Talked a little bit about the history of labor migration in South Africa. Again, labor migration, regional labor migration, something that's very Southern African, not at all dissimilar to Central American and Mexican labor migration into the United States as well. And then really gave us the opportunity to talk about the blurred lines between voluntary and forced migration. Because what's happened between Mozambique and South Africa for over 100 years is just like what's happening in the Mediterranean, right? It's very difficult to separate out who's a refugee or a forced migrant from forced labor in Portuguese companies into South Africa and who's an economic migrant. And the attempt to separate them out becomes very, very difficult. The author did such a nice job of showing that, and then we get to talk about it in the contemporary context. So, I think that that's just one example. Another example would be to look at refugees and IDPs, look at some excerpt from the 1951 Refugee Convention, look briefly at a UNHCR report. Some of the top refugee hosting countries in the world are in Africa now. Most refugees, 80% of refugees are hosted in the developing world now. And so it's really, and many of them are hosted in Africa. And so, obviously the biggest countries are Turkey and Pakistan, but Ethiopia is now number 1 in Africa, number 5 in the world. Kenya is the number 2 refugee hosting country in Africa, number 7 in the world. And then Uganda, DRC, and Chad are 8, 9, and 10 in the world. So really good opportunity, again, to look at a global issue of refugees, but have the opportunity to explore it through Africa. You can then do research on which countries, the US, which countries from Africa, the US is now accepting refugees from, where they're going to in the United States, which states, and then some opportunities to look at refugee innovation, again, to sort of diversify the sources. This is a Somali woman from Canada who's gone back to Somalia, who's become a phenomenon on Instagram. I don't have an Instagram account, but your students might then want to look up her account. She's interviewed on a SoundCloud talking about going back to Somalia. It's just a great, great clip. And then kind of gives them an opportunity to use a medium that they probably really love, hear a person much closer to their own age, with a very different refugee. And it's actually kind of a circular migration story, right? Because she grew up in Canada, she goes back to live with her grandmother in Somalia very recently. So a really neat story of that. So I want to wrap up, and I want to show you a couple of pictures, just because these are my migration pictures from recent trips, and I wanted to share one with you. So I have, in addition to my social studies research, I've been doing some work, a couple of projects in refugee camps in Djibouti and Kenya, and I want to share some of these pictures with you, just because I love pictures, and because I love human beings in these places, and I think they're really strong and courageous. So this is the Ali Adi refugee camp. There's about 25,000 refugees here, mostly Somalis, and they've been there for about 25 years. There are some Ethiopians and Eritreans. The Eritreans are very new refugees to this camp. So this is a water point, and we were doing environmental research. So we were looking at water and fuel access. So we were taking pictures mostly of water because we're interested in whether folks had enough access to water within this particular camp. But also how they were sharing water with the community outside the camp, which is also 100% ethnic Somalis as well. So we interviewed camp residents and people outside the camp, not just inside the camp, but outside the camp, called, in the language of migration, the host community, the people that are hosting the refugees. This is a restaurant inside the camp. These are people that have been there for 25 years, so the entrepreneurial types have amassed some resources and then used those resources to build more resources. So this is Restaurant Mogadishu. This is one of the many restaurants inside the camp. I went to another restaurant with our translator who speaks 8 languages. It's just an amazing man. He actually translated for Dan Connell, who was also with us in in the Howard program last time. So this is the main borehole outside the camp. So these are the host community folks using the main water borehole outside the refugee camp. So the borehole is built outside the camp, and the host community can access the water anytime they need it. And then it's piped inside the camp and regulated in a quota system in that other picture that you saw. And refugees get a UNHCR designated allotted quota of water. Those are all labeled jerry cans that you see for each refugee, and the water gets turned on and they get their quota and they go. But they are getting the quota that they're required. They're not getting less. They're getting the amount that's the internationally accepted standard. And actually, it seems to be working in this camp in that it's a shared resource, and both communities seem to be satisfied because the host community is getting the water that they need. It's not like the refugees are getting something that the host is not getting, which is happening in other camps. This is might be hard to see. Am I done?
You're good.
I'm done. Okay, I have 4 minutes.
No, 4 minutes.
Sorry, I just like showing pictures, and I had a hard time putting pictures earlier in my slides, so I wanted to share these with you. So in June, in addition to the social studies curriculum, I got to go up to Kakuma because I do some volunteer teaching for an online diploma program for refugees in refugee camps in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and Kakuma is one of the sites, so we were interviewing new diploma students in Kakuma. Kakuma has about 180,000 refugees. This is Kakuma from the air. This is the town, which probably has about 20,000 people. So the host community are mostly ethnic Turkana. They're Kenyan Turkana. They're mostly pastoralists, so they tend not to live in the city. So the town is actually quite small. 180,000 refugees, mostly South Sudanese, but Somalis as well. We interviewed students to come into the program who are Burundian, Congolese, DRC, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Rwandese, Ugandan women, and then lots and lots of South Sudanese. So incredibly ethnically and nationally diverse camp that's also been there for at least 25 years. It was originally founded for the, quote, lost boys of South Sudan in the early 1990s. It has grown into a major city in Kenya, the second largest camp after Dadaab, which is closer to the Somali border. This is in northwestern Kenya. Oops, I mixed up my slides, or making them the wrong way. So these are some school children. I wanted you to see some school children. These are high school students leaving school. Each school has a different school uniform color. There are 8 sort of wards, which I find a funny parallel to DC. To the camp. This is a shelter run by Jesuit Refugee Services, and that's Eunice in the middle, who is our guide. She's a social worker and a community support worker. And so women and families that need either domestic violence or gender-based violence protection, there's a shelter that JRS runs for them. When the boys become teenagers, they can't stay in the family shelter, so they have a shelter just for the teenage boys. Separate from the families, and it's a really beautiful shelter. We got to visit it. They go to school, they stay there, and they can visit their mothers and other siblings later. And then finally, this is just a shop, just another example of the entrepreneurship of refugees that have been there, sometimes for decades at a time. It feels like you're in just a major city in Kenya. It just happens to be a major city with gates on it, where people can leave without passes. It's a refugee camp, but it's a really amazing place, and there's lots of open source materials about these camps that provide really exciting opportunities to talk about migration stories to our students that really kind of diversify our understandings of refugee stories and migration stories from sub-Saharan Africa. So thanks for your time. I look forward to the discussion.
Sure.
So I just, in listening to your presentation, you kept saying, so forgive me if you already know, forgive me if you've seen it. A lot of this was new for me, so thank you for that. And I also just feel humbled about how little I know, even as a teacher. And so sort of overwhelmed by the idea of, sometimes very overwhelmed by the idea of being responsible for young minds exploring these topics when I'm just getting to understand a few of them myself. So I would say, looking at the refugee cities, that you described, it just sort of captured my imagination of how a refugee camp could house families for decades, sort of separated from the rest of the country and society, and what the possibilities are for integration of those refugees, what their futures are. I loved that you mentioned that you help with an online diploma system for refugees. I'd be very interested in learning more about that. I'm going to contact you about that privately. But if you could please speak to what these camps are really like for the people who live there and how they seem to acclimate and make their homes there. And it sounded like they were content. Can you speak to that?
We should have coffee. I can't answer that. I don't think they're content. No, they're not content, right? And people know. I think we have a major global crisis of people who are not content. On the other hand, people don't wait for the world to solve their problems, right? Which is why people... when I teach my migration course, I try to say, I start with the term agency, and we define agency, people's ability to creatively look for solutions. And then we say people make choices. So, some people stay in the camps and work hard to build a life there. And that's an expression of their agency, right? Their creative making of their lives. And then other people sometimes make risky choices to leave, knowing or not knowing what those risks involve, right? And those risky journeys, and I think that's part of what we're seeing. So, in my larger migration course, I'm really asking the students to kind of think about the choice sets that people are making and the information that they have, but to think about and appreciate that Africans, like other people around the world, are making those choices as an expression of their agency. But I don't think that the global refugee crisis of 65.3 million people, of which a large share of them are Africans and folks in the Middle East, I would actually not characterize them as satisfied with that. And in fact, what's really interesting in Kakuma in particular, as opposed to Djibouti, there are different camps. In Kakuma, a large share are South Sudanese, and South Sudanese have gone through so many periods of war and then peace, right? They've had several peace deals. And what we heard from South Sudanese that we were interviewing was, I would go back to South Sudan when the peace came, and then I'd be forced to come back. So, to the camp, right? So the camp functions as this place. So, what I'm saying is like, oh, it's complicated, which is such a cop-out. Like, I'm not trying to say that. I think people don't wait with their lives on hold forever, right? They build a life, but I also don't think that they're satisfied. Refugee camps are not a solution, and as a global community, and part of what we have to communicate to our students, and I 100% agree with you, I feel a tremendous burden of the young minds that sit in my classroom and the challenges of shaping them, and not misrepresenting the subjects that we have to teach. It's a great burden, so I share it with you.
A couple of points that Laura's building on are the different orientations toward area studies. She talks about thematic, sub-region. She talks about using some periods of history. So speak with us about the ways that you have oriented your classes in area studies. Have you used those particular frameworks for orientation, or a mix of them, as she suggested, or have you used other things? And how have you oriented your area studies courses?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Crane. I teach Asian Studies at Roosevelt High School, and I work with Susan and Laura and Frida to develop these themes, and that's really how I've approached the Asian Studies. We started with religion and society. We're going to also look at migration and travel, environment, authority and government. And one of the things that I make sure to make really clear to my students is like, this is Asia. Look at all of these countries. How are we going to study all of that? How much do you know about Texas, California, Idaho, right? We can't get it all in. So we just take a piece today we're talking about Hinduism in India, today we're talking about Islam in Indonesia, and we clump it like that. So I think it helps students see that, there is a lot going on, and we can't get all of it, and nobody's going to be an expert on anything in a one semester course. So.
Yeah, so a similar thing. I didn't, hadn't coordinated, I guess, and gotten those teams ahead of time, but basically the way I organized it on my own was kind of similar in that it's just case studies of a country with a theme, right, for each one. So we'll do revolutions, and I'm doing, focusing on Cuba and Mexico or something, and then we'll do environment and focus on somewhere else. So I like the way that the themes are put together here. I think one of the challenging things is when I look at, I'm trying to at least focus on for a couple days all the different pieces of Latin America, which in some ways might not be as complex as doing Africa with 55 countries or something like that, but trying to cover all the cultures within it, and how do we focus an even amount. I think one of the challenges is I don't want it to be a history and politics of Latin American class. I want them to get the culture as much as possible in a way that connects to the students. So how do we organize that in units, I think has been the most challenging part for me, because these themes might serve as a model for that. Right now it's a lot of 2 or 3 day case study, and then another 2 or 3 day case study with a country and a theme for each one. So I think the challenge is how do I organize all of these once I have those put together into themes that are units that are 2 or 3 weeks and have collective vocabulary that are studied within those units, and projects that might be able to span a couple countries within the same theme.
Hi, I'm Leslie Welsh from Capital City Public Charter School, and I teach World History 1. And so it's actually really cool that you both have mentioned the danger of the single story, because I framed my entire course around that. So we started the school year with, I read all these blogs and newspapers about DC, and I see all these headlines and comments where people are like, these teens in DC are always punching people in the face and robbing people, and they're terrible and they're up to no good. And I'm always like, these aren't the teens that I know. I know the teens in DC. And so I started by presenting that information to them, and then they had to tell their side of the story. So we're calling it single story versus the complex story. And so all these places that we're looking at, so we're basically studying the medieval era, 600 to 1400-ish, all around the globe. And what I realized last year, this is only my second year teaching it, and what I realized last year when I was teaching it was they had all these single stories as we're applying them about these cultures. When we studied China, God, the things that they were saying, I was like, oh God. So I kind of wanted to build on that and help them see that actually we just don't know a lot about these cultures. So why don't you be the agents of change and help your friends and neighbors to see a more complex story because of what you're going to learn in this class. So we just got into Islam and Muslims, and so that has a very big single story of terrorism here in America. And so they even had a little hook into that already, and we looked at that a little bit more. And then I'm going to show them Pew survey data that shows that actually a lot of people don't know anything about Islam. And so we're going to say, let's learn about that, and what can we learn that helps to tell a more complex story. So I've actually been really interested in what you were saying. Some of the stuff you already showed us about Africa, I think will really help to frame as we move into that coming up. So thank you.
As we move into the coffee break, I would encourage these conversations to continue about basically this idea of single story versus, I love to borrow your term, the complex story, the idea of how you orient your studies to area studies through epics, through themes, through regions. And also how we want to build off what Scott introduced us to as well, building it and connecting to the student's own identity and their personal journey. I can imagine my father-in-law grew up most of his life in DC. My family, his family, and I was blessed enough to marry into, has a wonderful migration story from the South. And just talking about for many of your students who may be, if you live in DC, for the large African-American population, what was the Great Migration here? Where did your grandparents come from? Why did they move? Now, why are the reasons for migration in the area studies of your course right there? So how does that actually impact you, maybe in your history, maybe in contemporary times, and how those reasons, that context, that circumstance is the same for this particular area, either in history that we're studying or this particular area